Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to my FigureItOutcast for June 2019. To all Patreon backers, that's what this is. This is a Patreon podcast. However, it is eventually available to the public, which I appreciate all of you listening. But to the Patreon backers specifically, the first thing I want to talk about this month is that I'm sorry this podcast was very late. Usually I try to do this right at the beginning, but my schedule precluded that from being possible, primarily because of E3 and all the reasons I had to go out there early and all that stuff. So I do seriously apologize for that. However, I've attempted to make up for it with a lot of content that I posted at E3. Which I also must preface this video by saying that I realize a lot of people are probably like, oh, okay, he'll talk about a lot of the things that happened at E3. But the thing is, I talked about a lot of those already in my E3 coverage videos, on the Xbox conference, the Ubisoft conference, Bethesda conference, Nintendo conference, and so on and so forth, as well as a lot of the Shenmue drama that came about as of late. And so I won't be talking about a lot of that stuff because I've done it. So it was actually kind of difficult to find subjects for this month, but I did come up with some cool stuff, I think. So one thing I can definitely talk about, let's just jump into it. E3. Now, if at any time if you feel like changing subjects, looking around there, you can check out the description. I'm going to have all the subjects listed there, and you can feel free to jump around to the time code to any subject you want. If there's one you care about or don't care about or whatever, it's there. So now, back on point. Our first official subject here is E3 2019 minus all of the things that I've already covered in other videos. So I won't talk about like my full-on, just like every single thing I did at E3, although I will say this, best E3 I ever had. Got to do a lot of crazy stuff, and I'll leave it there. But yeah, I got to do a couple of, for the purposes of this subject, I got to do a couple of behind-the-scenes things. I got a close-up look at Lego Star Wars. Let's talk about that first. The new Lego Star Wars game actually looks really fascinating. It's not like the old ones where it was kind of traditional and that it followed the basic story of any of the movies, and you had to go from one movie to the next and so on and so forth. You could replay them, and you could, of course, replay the individual levels with other characters and all that kind of stuff. This is very different. This is very, very, very open world. Like, the demo they showed us was, they said, okay, you've got all 9 of the Saga films, which means Solo, Rogue One, as well as the Clone Wars movie, the Clone Wars show, Rebels. That stuff is not part of this. However, the 9 Skywalker Saga films, obviously, hence the name, are canon with this. So you can jump from movie to movie at will, but it changes up basically the galaxy you're in. So, for example, they started off by saying, all right, we're going to go with Return of the Jedi. So it opens with, you end up in the Millennium Falcon at the beginning, and you have the option to fly basically to any number of planets that exist throughout all of the 9 movies. Now, it drops you near Tatooine, because if in Return of the Jedi, Tatooine is where the movie starts. So it's basically suggesting to you should fly into Tatooine and start your adventure there, but you don't actually have to do that. But for the purposes of the demo, that's what they did. So he goes down to Tatooine, he lands there, and he's like, and so I'm thinking, okay, cool. It's going to start, following the story. And he's like, now that you're on Tatooine, you can go anywhere on Tatooine. He's like, there's multiple cities. He's like, there's Mos Espa, Mos Eisley, I think it was Anchorhead. Anchorhead, which I found was kind of funny, because Anchorhead is a city that's mentioned just by name by Luke one time in A New Hope, and they made the city in the game. And he's like, we've got all sorts of spots, like Jabba's palace is there, the cantina is of course there, but that's part of Mos Eisley. And he's like, we got the Sarlacc pit, and we got all that stuff. It's everything you know about Tatooine is there. And so he's going on to show that it's every single planet has like 1 million collectibles and all that sorts of stuff, and you don't actually have to really do anything story related, though you can. But it's very, 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 very open world. And then he said one of the things that's cool about it, the way they did it, is they designed it to be timeline sensitive. So he points out, as an example, he's like, all right, so we're going to go over to Jabba's palace. Now, in Jabba's palace, right outside of Jabba's palace, there's the skiff, which is that vehicle that they use in Return of the Jedi to take everyone to the Sarlacc pit and throw them in. He's like, in Return of the Jedi, it makes sense that it would be there. However, if you were to say go there in A New Hope, it wouldn't be there yet. So then I remember asking, I was the only person to ask the dude a question after it ended, because he just had a speech and then everybody left, and I just stood around for a second and I asked him, like, all right, just so I'm clear on the timelines thing, are you essentially giving canonical explanations for what planets look like at certain time frames? So for example, you obviously can go to Hoth during Empire, but could I go to Hoth during, say, The Last Jedi and see what it looked like, you know, that many years after the Empire had been there? Or could I go there in Phantom Menace and see what it looked like that many years before the Rebels and the Empire ever went there? And he said yes, and it will be different. So that's crazy and kind of awesome. And I'm really looking forward to how, like, insanely big that game is inevitably going to be. So there was that. And then after that, I went to a private session thing for Cyberpunk 2077, which was pretty cool. Or is that the full name, 2077? Either way, you know what I'm talking about, Cyberpunk. So a buddy of mine got me a VIP pass into that thing, and I went in, and they just give you this like 25-minute presentation about the game where one of the developers is playing it, and another one's basically telling you, like, we're going to do this and he's going to do that, and here's some of the mechanics. And I'm just going to say it this way, although I'm sure everybody came to the same conclusion: that game looks cool as shit. And it's a game that has a lot of consequences. So, like, you can make one decision, but it will, like, completely alter the rest of the game, and it's irreversible. So you just have to roll with it. And it looked like a hell of a lot of fun and a lot of hacking and that kind of stuff that leads to strange combinations. Like, for example, he was like invading this one area, and because you can hack stuff and every character has like cyborg components, if you have the right kind of hacking skills, you can like hack this guy from a distance and he'll like be forced to shoot himself in the head, you know, like random cool stuff like that. But yeah, Cyberpunk looked pretty awesome. Along the same vein, I got to check out Techland's Dying Light 2, which was the same basic type of thing. It's like they have you sit down, one guy plays it, another guy walks you through it and talks you through it, and they give you this presentation of live gameplay. And you can see the guy play, and he's telling you all this stuff. And it was actually very similar in that, like, hey, we were getting to this moment, and everything is very quick. You have to respond very quickly. So, like, we were in a situation where a character was dying, so you have to decide within, like, 5 to 10 seconds, like, do I stay to try and help this person, or do I run off to try and find the guy that attacked him? So for the purposes of their demo, they had him run off to try and find the guy. And then as you go with that, more choices are presented, and there's consequences for those choices. And they said, again, those choices are irreversible. The second you make one, it's permanent. It saves. The only way to try the other choices is if you restart the entire game. And he said that you'll want to do that because there's so many different splits that and different outcomes that can happen as a result of that kind of thing. It was funny. Those two games really reminded me a lot of each other, and I think they're both Polish developed, so it wouldn't surprise me if there's some sort of cross wiring there that's happening. But yeah, so that's definitely those two games look really, really cool. Then I got to do a private capture session of Borderlands 3, which you could play the game for like basically 10 to 15 minutes. I'll be doing a video on that. I'll show you guys the footage I've got. Now I have to admit freely that I didn't really play the other Borderlands games, at least not for very long. And with this, it was fun. You know, it was a cool FPS with, you know, attitude, which is a terrible 90s ass way to describe it, but it was just, that's the way I would do it. It was a fun thing in the time I played it. So we'll go more into that when I actually show you guys the footage. I also got to play Ghost Recon Breakpoint at the Ubisoft Loft. That thing was cool. Played that for like an hour. It was like myself and 3 other guys in a squad, and they had some, like, basically some missions and stuff kind of set up for us just so that you could get like a taste of it. And they said, like, some of the stuff's kind of, you know, super easy, and then we have this one mission that's, like, you know, really, really hard, and it's going to require all of you, and most people don't succeed. Where we basically had to take down like this big, like, super tank type of thing, but we ended up doing it. We ended up actually being successful. So I don't know if they were just like praising us just because, like, oh, you actually did it, or just like, oh yeah, that's cute, you did it, when, you know, anybody could really do it. Like, we were just like little kids who succeeded. Who knows? Either way, I had a good time with that. I also have footage of that one as well, so I'll put something up at some point so you guys can see it. And this is just, you know, there's this other game I got to play. It wasn't like a big deal or anything. Shenmue 3. Yeah, obviously that meant a lot to me. I'm not going to talk about that one in this podcast, though, because I did an entire video discussing this in great detail. So if you're curious how Shenmue 3 plays, by all means, check out that video. But yeah, I had an absolute blast at E3, and I'm sure you're like, well, wait, that's it? That's all you played? Yeah, welcome to E3. You don't really get to play much. People have this delusion that E3 is like, oh, I'm just gonna go and I'm just gonna play all the new games and it's gonna be awesome and it's like that's all I'm gonna do. It's like, no, dude, you're lucky if you can do any of that, because when you do that for media stuff, you get like a couple games, you can skip some lines, but usually you're just kind of there for coverage, to try and learn about stuff, and then you can play some stuff, but really you have to prioritize your time. You don't want to, depending on what your job is or whatever, you don't want to just wait in lines all day and just hope to play like 10 minutes of a game. It's not the most efficient use of your time. If you're there purely for entertainment purposes, that's another matter. I mean, but even then you'll be lucky to wait in lines all day. You'll get like 2 or 3 games in. That's just the reality of how it works. But nevertheless, I had a great time there, and I could talk about E3 forever this year, but so many individual stories, but this is not the time for them. So let's move on. The next subject up, and I did an entire video on this, so I'm going to keep this very brief, but in case you missed it, Microsoft announced during E3 that Xbox backwards compatibility was coming to an end for Xbox One, meaning no more original Xbox games or Xbox 360 games will be heading there. They did go out with a bang. They added like 8 new original Xbox games to the catalog, which I covered in an entire video. And then they added a bunch more 360 games. I want to say it was like 15 of them. And then they did a bunch of 4K updates for, I think it was mostly the rare replay stuff. But yeah, and then they gave away 2 Human is now digitally free, or at least it is at the time I record this. And so you can grab that if you want. But yeah, honestly, the backwards compatibility program, if we're going to do a little post-mortem here, I think obviously it was a great thing that they did that. I'm not surprised that it's stopping. I'm a little surprised they stopped the 360 program, but their reasoning seems to be, at least publicly, we're working on Project Scarlet and we're working on backwards compatibility for that, which that's its own can of worms. Like, they could just be transferring over the work that's already done, or they could be starting some sort of a new initiative program, which we don't know about yet. Hopefully one that reads entirely off disk. That way you could theoretically play everything, which would be fantastic, but we don't know that yet. But I have to admit, like, the whole history of backwards compatibility on Xbox One is kind of hilarious to me. Because there was a time back in, like, I think it was PAX West, or the time PAX Prime, 2014. I remember going out at the convention. Microsoft had this thing where they were like busing people. They were shuttling them from PAX West over to like their studio in Redmond, and you could go there and play a bunch of games and all this stuff. And I remember going, and I've told this story before, so I'm just going to do the short version. The short version is I did Microsoft a small favor by getting them some footage. And then as like a way to kind of thank me, what they did was I just asked if I could talk to Major Nelson for a minute, because I'd never met the man. I just thought that'd be kind of cool. And they were like, yeah, we could arrange that. So they bring him out and he just talks to me for a couple minutes, and I take a photo with him, that type of basic ass thing. And then I remember asking him specifically, because at the time, Microsoft's policy on backwards compatibility is we're not doing it. We don't care about doing 360. But they never addressed original Xbox, like, at all. And so I remember asking him about that, and he just looked at me and he was like, do you understand how hard it is to, to do 360 compatibility and stuff? And I was like, no, not 360 compatibility. Original Xbox, the one from 2001. They're both x86 based, I know legally, with legalese, with legalese, it would actually be, tougher with license issues and all that stuff. But from a hardware perspective, it shouldn't be that difficult. I was just curious if you guys had ever even thought about it. And he just kind of stared at me blankly for a second. He just goes, no, we're not doing that. Anyway, fast forward a few years later, and they've now terminated the program in which they did both. Now, I don't blame him. I'm sure that was the policy at the time, was, who cares? Though I did get one small post-mortem to that particular story, or a PS, I should say, a postscript to that story. I think it was at PAX West last year. I was walking around, and this dude walked up to me. He's like, oh, Adam, dude, big fan, blah, blah, blah. He's talking to me for a second. He's like, and he's telling me, like, oh, I actually work over at Xbox. And I was like, oh, that's cool, man. And then he told me, he's like, yeah, you remember that story you told about Major Nelson and the backwards compatibility? I was like, yeah. He's like, so I'm just going to tell you, there was a time where he would tell, apparently there was a time where he would tell like the reverse of that, like, yeah, this one nerd like asked me if we were going to do that. And someone in the room just said like, well, why can't we do that? And it's like, and he's like, I'm certainly not giving you credit for this, but he's like, you kind of got the ball rolling a little bit in like a joking type of way. And I'm like, dude, are you fucking serious with me? Are you just fucking with me? And he was like, no, that happened. He's like, but I don't, he's like, it was years before anybody cared, but at least the conversation kind of started there. So I kind of personally think he was pulling my chain, to be honest with you. But I will remember that. I will remember how cool it felt, even though I don't really believe that's actually true. I think they would have done that regardless if I had ever bothered Major Nelson about it or not. But regardless, it's Xbox backwards compatibility is coming to an end, and hopefully Project Scarlet does it well. So that's that. Moving on. Star Wars Galaxy's Edge is now open at Anaheim Disney. I've not been there yet. There was a small possibility of that happening while I was out there for E3, but everything I've heard about it, it's like it's just too insane. The whole thing is way too big. It's got way too many people, and it's just, which is not surprising. It's like the first time in a long time that Disney's done a major overhaul to the theme park, so it's not surprising at all that people are wanting to check that out in droves. So I'm hoping to check that out at some point, maybe in like a few years when the hype is a little bit less extreme. That would be kind of nice. But yeah, if anybody has actually been to it so far, I know some of my friends have. I'm curious what you guys think, and if you enjoyed it or not. But yeah, really nothing else to say about that. Although I still don't know if they're building one in other parts of the country. I know they did one in Anaheim. I think they might be doing one in Florida if they haven't. And then I don't know about the rest of the world, like Tokyo Disney or Euro Disney or anything. But I am very curious. I would also love to go there just to see some of the crazy merch that they would have. 'Cause some of that crossover stuff to me is like just neat. But very curious. But oh no, oh well, we'll see one day. Next subject. So this is long overdue. Does anybody remember the Fallout 76 Collector's Edition debacle, where they basically promised, I think it was the Armored Edition, and they promised everybody these like really nice like canvas bags, but inside it was just like a shitty little plastic like drawstring bag, and it just pissed everyone off. So there was, I don't remember if it was like a class action lawsuit or what it was exactly, but something convinced Bethesda to actually honor this, probably due to legal requirements. And apparently Bethesda finally sent out these nicer, newer official canvas bags for the game, and people have started receiving them throughout the time that I'm recording this. And I'm happy for the people who got them, although I do question if you even care anymore. Because the impression I got from Bethesda's E3 conference, which was kind of the "we're sorry" conference, but all of the comments that on my video about that, at least on my coverage, was, you know, fuck Bethesda for this. I don't know how they think this is going to make up for it, blah, blah, blah. And it seems like even though they're giving away a bunch of free DLC and free updates and all that type of stuff to Fallout 76, it seems like people just do not care and are not willing to forgive them on that yet. So I'm wondering if the bag situation helps. I mean, I know it should have been done correctly in the first place. You promised that type of bag, it should have been that type of bag. But yeah, I don't know. As someone who didn't buy it, I can't say, but I am curious if anybody out there did, if they received it, and what they think of it. So there's that. Next up, The Witcher 3 was announced to be coming to the Switch. This was kind of known for a while, although this was the official, leak, or not leak, the official announcement of it. What came of that later was the resolution specs of the game. On the Switch, it will run in 720p when it's docked, and 540p portably. And so, I've thought about this a bit, and I'm like, okay, well, The Witcher 3 is a game that can run in 4K, on an Xbox One X, obviously on a PC as well. I don't know. I think at least on the PS4 Pro, at least it gets maybe close to those type of benchmarks, not quite, but it performs a lot better on those platforms. So this just seems kind of hilarious. And then you think about it for a second and go, well, is anybody buying it? Like, is there anybody out there who's buying The Witcher 3 to play it on a television using the Switch? I would put it as a comically low number. Like, if you're the person who the Switch is their only console and you have no choice but to play your games on a Switch on a TV with this, you know, if that's your only way, sure, that's an exception. But for the majority of people, the only way to play The Witcher 3, the only reason to play The Witcher 3 on a Switch is because of the portable aspect, which apparently will run at a funky 540p, which is actually, I mean, that's not only sub HD. I mean, that's like kind of almost sub SD, or well, it is SD, but it's lower than 576p, which is the standard PAL equivalency of like 480p. So it's a weird resolution, and obviously scaling it down that much was necessary in order to get the game to run at a stable frame rate and just even be playable. So it's interesting. I'm sure it will look bad, but I think that's not really the point of the story, even though that's the way they get your attention. It's more so the fact that the selling point of it is, yeah, it's not going to look amazing on a tiny little screen, but the fact is you can play The Witcher 3 portably. Whereas even the 4K best Ultra HD version available for a PC, you're not going to do that with. Well, unless you have a laptop, I suppose, but like a super portable one. But it's not exactly the same thing, you know what I'm saying? So I find it interesting. It is an interesting phase that we're in with the Switch, where some people look at it and go like, it fails to hit all these benchmarks, it's useless. And it's like, if you compare its home console capabilities, sure, but for those people, I'd say, well, it's not meant for that. It's meant more for the portability. And I say that as a devout like console television gamer, but I still acknowledge it. So in my case, would I ever play Witcher 3 on Switch? No, because I don't really care about the portability, and it's certainly not the way to play it at home on a console. But I respect the fact that they're giving you the choice to people who do want to play it portably. So there you go. Next up, this is it shouldn't be me reporting on this, because it's just funny. Like, this is something I would have reported on even if I didn't have such a love for this franchise, but this is a Shenmue piece of news, and I know, I'm sorry, I talk about it a lot, but in this case, this is something that even if I didn't care about Shenmue, like I said, I probably would report on, because it's just kind of fascinating. There is a new, apparently some people figured out after 20 years that there was a secret punch combo in that game that was hidden in the data. Now, I believe this surfaced through the PC version of the re-release, and then, you know, it was data mined, and they found out that it was still actually in the Dreamcast version. It's basically like this uppercut move, kind of from as an homage to Street Fighter. Apparently, this is not natively unlockable within the game, but it's just kind of fascinating that Shenmue still has so many damn secrets. It is such a weird game. I love it, obviously, to death. But the fact that it could actually still have that many secrets left is just crazy, that it could have that in there. Because I mean, now the Shenmue nerd in me comes out, and I'll put him back in the cave, appropriately enough, in a second. But you know, the thing with that game is there was stuff in that game that people weren't finding out for years. This is obviously the latest. There was one where there was like certain cutscenes you could only unlock if your Dreamcast was set to a certain calendar date, and you did a whole bunch of stuff, and then randomly this and that would occur that was completely irrelevant, but it would still occur anyway. It's like, man, what an intricate, detailed game. And we'll just leave it at that, because obviously I've talked about that game to death. So moving on. Let's do a round of shout outs. Now, like I said at the beginning of this podcast is brought to you by your Patreon, or my Patreon supporters and backers, and I really appreciate them. If at any time you'd like to support me, not just to have, you know, be a shout out or anything like that, you can actually be on this podcast, you can pick subjects for it, and you can also support the channel. You can get early access to videos, and you can just help me out, which I really do appreciate in these dark YouTube times. But anyway, so thank you. But the following people are all at the Patreon level in which they get a shout out. So thank you very much to the following: Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Peralez, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. Once again, that's Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Peralez, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. Thank you guys. You are all heroes to me. Now moving on, our next subject here is that Hyperkin is releasing their own Nintendo 64 clone console, which makes it the first Nintendo 64 clone console at all. And this is interesting for multiple reasons. One, it obviously means that legally speaking, the N64 has finally aged out, whereas Nintendo can't actually give them shit for replicating the hardware anymore. which is why this has been it's part of the reason anyway, why these clone consoles come out in basically the same order that the original consoles did. Partially it's the technology curve and the ability to more easily replicate them, yes, but also it just has to do with the legal ramifications, and as soon as they get past a certain point, I think it's like 20 years, then they can finally start tinkering with them. So the N64 has finally reached that point, and Hyperkin apparently is going to be first to the market with one. Now, my buddy Gilly the Kid, who was another YouTuber, kind of said it best when he said, "I'm really glad Hyperkin is making this because now it means that someone with talent can make one." I got nothing against Hyperkin really, but I've never really liked that many of their products. I've been told in the past that their brand is just not, it's known for not being that great, and a lot of engineers are just tired of working on mediocre things, so they've been leaving and working on other stuff instead. So Hyperkin, to their credit, is trying to fix their image a bit. I don't believe that this N64 will accomplish that. First of all, I generally do not have faith in clone consoles. There's very few that are worth recommending. The Atari Flashback 2 is one of them because it was designed by like a really intelligent engineer who wanted to make a perfect Atari 2600 that just didn't have a cartridge slot, but he made it easy to add one. The thing's flawless. And then the AVS, which is an amazing NES replica, is perfect. But things like Retron and stuff, I do not support any of those. Those are usually made like shit. They're just emulator boxes, and I'm more about FPGAs. If you're gonna do it through an FPGA or do like legit hardware like the Atari Flashback 2. But anyway, so the Hyperkin N64, personally, I don't know exactly how it works, but if knowing them, it's probably emulation. N64 emulation has never been great. So I reserve judgment, but we'll see. If the AVS guys can make an N64, that would be awesome. Now one must question, why do we even care? Other than convenience, really the reason is the N64 is a very beloved console, but it also seriously lacks in the video quality department because the native output was just S-video. That was the best it could do. They can be RGB modified, which is a relatively easy mod now, but the improvement that comes from S-video to RGB on the N64 is, while it is present, it is minimal. So the next move up is there are HDMI boards that can be installed now in the N64, and it's called the Ultra, I think it's called the Ultra 64, or Ultra HDMI 64. Those things are cool, but prohibitively expensive. Like the board alone's like $150, and the guy who makes them won't sell them to people. He will only do like pre-installed consoles. So it's one of those will set you back like $400 minimum. So it's just kind of an insane product. So hopefully Hyperkin's thing will drive that down a little, but in the meantime, unless the Ultra HDMI thing can become more affordable, I will wait until someone like AVS can do a proper N64 FPGA, and we'll see what happens with that, if I do that at all. But anyway, after that, speaking of replica hardware, the Genesis Mini. So I actually got to try this finally over at the Sega booth at E3. To Sega's credit, they had a really neat setup there where it just kind of looked like a 90s basement with a Genesis connected and stuff. And I played it for a little bit. It was actually kind of funny. I got in, I got over there and I was sitting next to a couple guys, and one of them was like a journalist who was asking the Sega guys like some questions about it. And I'm just sitting there listening to this. And the guy's going through the list of games, and he asks the Sega employees, like, why Tetris? What makes that game special? And the Sega employee is just like, I don't know. It was just a classic game, and kind of just not his fault. To be fair, that's not an accurate representation of Sega, because it was just traditionally what they do with the show floor guys like that is they're just kind of people they hire that are not really affiliated with a company. They just need humans to basically pay attention to stuff just for events. So he's probably not like a legit Sega employee. But he didn't really know the answer as to why Tetris was on there, and I just raised my hand. I'm like, am I allowed to answer this? And the guy was like, sure. And I was like, yeah, so the reason Tetris is on there is it's the rarest Sega Mega Drive or Sega Genesis game. Only 6 copies of it ever came out, only in Japan, and then it just vanished. So that's the ROM dump of that game available for the first time outside of that release. So it's essentially an unreleased game. And he's like, oh, well, thank you. And then the guy like thanked me for the information in case anybody else ever asked him. And then another dude was like playing. He's like, how come Sonic 3 and Sonic and Knuckles aren't on there? Like, when's, how come that keeps happening? And the other dude's like, I don't know. And I was like, can I answer this one? And he was just like, yeah. And I was like, well, it's because Michael Jackson did the music for those games. And since his death, his estate has not been super cooperative in allowing it, licensing, blah, 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 blah. And it was like, oh, all right. Okay, that makes sense. So, yeah, that's the thing. Anyway, so I played it, and I'm sitting there testing it. And it was fun because I played Sonic 2. And I did what I always do when I play Sonic 2 is like I memorized as a kid what the little cheat codes is to like, become Supersonic. And so I immediately did it, and I started playing as Supersonic within a moment. And the cool thing is Sega was filming a video of every person playing it and asking them like, did you have a Sega Genesis? What's your memory of having one? What was your favorite game? Like that kind of basic question. So I filmed a little bit, and I may or may not end up in some sort of promo video for this thing. I honestly don't know, but probably not, because they were interviewing like tons of people, so we'll see what ends up happening there. But either way, I got to play the Genesis Mini. Now you might ask, like, are you going to buy one? No, because I don't do the whole mini clone console emulator thing. But I can say this, as compared to the previous shithole attempts of these little emulator boxes that have been put out for the Genesis, which sadly were licensed by Sega, this one is actually good. The emulation was done by M2. The hardware was done in-house. It wasn't done by AtGames or any of those crappy things. So it actually will be a solid little box. Probably hacked very quickly to allow you to put every damn game on there ever. But yeah, that's not really my thing. But it'll be there I'm sure if you guys want it. So hopefully if people like it, then they go out and buy it. Oh, and as a side note, in Japan, they're getting plastic additional Sega CD and Sega 32X add-ons for it. They don't do anything, but they're there. Of course, leading to speculation that maybe you can hack it to play Sega CD and 32X, which I obviously don't know, but I would assume so, because I imagine the hardware that's in there is just more capable than that whole combination, and therefore you could write your own different emulator for it. Kind of like the way the Super Nintendo Classic, people discovered they could put PS1 games on there, and amusingly enough, it actually ran them better than the PS1 Classic, which is kind of hilarious. But anyway, so that's that. But speaking of these classic consoles, on our next subject, Konami announced that they're doing the TurboGrafx 16 Classic or 16 Mini. And I just go like, when did Konami get the rights to that? I mean, NEC was the company that put that out. I mean, obviously that it must have changed hands, because I'm pretty sure NEC doesn't exist anymore, so it's whatever. But they announced a few different games for this thing, and I'm just like, huh, okay, that's fascinating. I can't imagine that one does anywhere near as well, because the TurboGrafx 16 did not do well at all in North America. And as far as I know, at this point, there is no PC Engine version of this, where it might have actually been successful in Japan, possibly. I think that super collectors and stuff will be interested in this thing. They'll find it fascinating as a little oddity to own. But whether or not we'll actually make any money is another debate, especially coming from Konami, who does not really have the best reputation anymore. Hopefully, if they do this correctly, I would hope they do this correctly, and everybody's learned from the PlayStation Classic. You can't just make a pile of shit and expect everyone to buy it. Hopefully it's good, but with Konami, the modern version of Konami attached, I'm not super optimistic. So the next one though is Atari, the Atari VCS, which is another one of these damn clone consoles. This one is unique though, for not good reasons. Unlike all these others that are trying to capitalize on nostalgia and look a lot and feel a lot like the originals, the Atari VCS is trying to present itself like it's a new thing when it's not. So my understanding of it is it's a beefy piece of hardware. The basic version, the base model, has 4 gigabytes of RAM. The all-in model has 8 gigabytes of RAM. And it's designed to basically play Atari 2600 games in like 4K, which makes no sense. The base model of this thing is $250, and the all-in model is $390. Again, I remind you, this thing just plays Atari 2600 games, admittedly in high resolutions, but this is ridiculous. Like, laughably ridiculous. It also doesn't look like an Atari 2600. It looks like well, I mean, admittedly, what they're trying to do, a modern version of an Atari 2600. And I find it hilarious that there are still people saying, hey, Atari's back, and they're like competing directly with Xbox and PlayStation. I'm like, no, this is a clone box, and it's not a good one. It might be the best way ever to play Atari 2600 games, possibly, but that price point is hilariously absurd. So it might be, once it's hacked, it might actually be something really neat. They might, because of how much horsepower it has, you might be able to put like, who knows, like all sorts of emulators on that thing, and it would be like the ultimate like retro beast machine, digitally speaking anyway. But to get this just for Atari 2600 games is asinine. But yeah, so that's that. I read another. All right, so next subject. I read a story that kind of fascinated me because it seemed kind of ironic. GameStop has completed its acquisition, or is about to complete its acquisition of ThinkGeek. Now, ThinkGeek is a website that's been around for a while where they just sold all sorts of like nerdy merchandise. I remember looking on there, and they would have like, Wampa skin rugs, to celebrate Star Wars, or they would have like miniature flux capacitors, just random stuff like that. Just pretty cool. Now, apparently GameStop acquired them back in 2015, but because of how mergers and things like that work, they don't actually finally clear the last hurdle until July 2nd of 2019. And so I find this amusing because now, I mean, GameStop was doing fine-ish, I guess, in 2015. They were obviously starting to move more towards that toys thing, which they're now much bigger on. But now, fast forward to where we are in time, GameStop is on the verge of collapse itself. So to read that they were finally finishing a merger was kind of hilarious. I was not expecting to read something like that. In fact, I originally misread the article as ThinkGeek acquires GameStop, because I was like, that makes more sense almost, given that GameStop's basically tanking. But no, apparently GameStop's going to finish acquiring them, and we'll see how much longer GameStop will be around. I don't know exactly. Nobody knows exactly when GameStop is going to go under. It seems kind of inevitable to most people, but it's just a matter of when. So, yeah. Next up, Toy Story 4. I was hoping to have seen this by the time we got to this podcast, but I have not. And I wasn't even going to include it, except I shouldn't have done it, but I read a couple of reviews and people were actually saying it's surprisingly good, which I wasn't expecting. But if that's the case, then I'm way more excited for it. So I will obviously check it out, but yeah, now I have more hope, as the bar has been raised slightly, because originally it was just going to be like, just don't let this be complete garbage that ruins the characters. But the initial reviews I read was like, no, this was actually surprisingly good. It shouldn't continue. Stop pressing your luck, but this was a good movie. So I look forward to assessing that on my own. But that's just a small tidbit. Now, speaking of small tidbits of movies that don't need to be made, including another Toy Story after that, I legit thought this was a joke and then realized it wasn't. Spice Girls, you remember them? They're getting an animated movie. I don't know why. I still find it weird that they had a movie in the late 90s. I mean, they were superstars. They were like everywhere. They were huge. So to an extent, I get it, I guess, back then. But it's like, dude, that's a thing that's over. Like, who do they think is going to watch a Spice Girls animated movie? I just don't get it. Like, you could probably milk the Spice Girls for a little bit of nostalgia at this point, but a whole movie, especially an animated one, I don't know who that's catering to. Because the people who remember the Spice Girls like fondly are probably too old or not interested in watching an animated film. So I don't know. I'm certainly not among the crowd that would care about this, but I just wanted to include it because I was just so blown away by the fact that was even real. But a movie I did see, and this will top off our podcast here, this will be the last subject for the show, is Godzilla, King of the Monsters, or Godzilla 2, King of the Monsters, depending on where you are. This is the third movie in the MonsterVerse, which originally was Godzilla in 2014, then Kong Skull Island, I want to say like 2017, and now this in 2019. And I saw this movie a little while ago, and I'm still trying to digest it. Like, to be honest, it's been a while and I still can't quite process how I feel about it, because the 2014 Godzilla, it was a film I kind of respected, but I didn't really enjoy all that much. There were parts of it I enjoyed, the monster fights, like the same thing that kind of everybody's already said. Kong Skull Island I actually thought was pretty good. I actually liked that a lot more than I expected to like it. And I want you guys to understand something. Like, I am a Godzilla super fan. Like, I have every movie on DVD at least, if not Blu-ray. I even have a very clean cut of Godzilla 1985, the American version, like the weird one that has Raymond Burr in it and like scenes with Dr. Pepper and stuff. Like, I have that in a clean cut for DVD. And so like I've acquired it all. Now, because I've seen these movies so many times, I've gotten kind of used to them and everything. And like, there's two very distinct versions of Godzilla. Basically, there's the like legit version that's like a dramatic piece, like Gojira or Shin Godzilla, the Japanese Godzilla movie that came out a few years ago. Or I think it was 2017, 2018. Yeah, something like that. That movie was fucking fantastic. And that was like when they take the character and they make him like really like a legitimate dramatic story and everybody takes it serious. Then there's like the Saturday morning cartoon Godzilla where he has to fight like 18 monsters and it's, you know, he becomes a hero that protects people and stuff. And those versions of him always include a lot of, I'm not gonna say fantasy elements, but like absurd elements that we're meant to accept. Like in those storylines, for some reason, technology is just way better than it is in real life. Like they have spaceships that can fly around easily and just shoot these like laser cannons and everything, like stuff that doesn't exist at all, but they just have it and it's fine. There's no explanation. And there's these weird like army groups that are specifically designed to focus on monsters and stuff. And I always accepted it because I was like, well, it's dubbed and it's just kind of hilarious and it's just Saturday morning cartoon. Like I take it as like a live action Saturday morning cartoon. Godzilla King of the Monsters is the third time Americans have tried to make a Godzilla movie, including the terrible 1998, Godzilla. So the first, that terrible 1998 attempt, we don't even count, but the Godzilla we got in 2014 was an attempt to make the serious movie, and it didn't really deliver. So then the King of the Monsters movie was, in my opinion, the one that did the Saturday morning cartoon approach. It's hard to accept that film as an actual sequel to the other one because they're tonally extremely different, and there's a giant technology jump in between. Like this one, it has like, there's just all sorts of like the submarine technology is like infinitely better, and all this other stuff that they have. This army technology is suddenly like way better, and they have the ability to track all these monsters through just like a machine that someone just decided they could build. And it's just like, and people just do really stupid things. All of these actions though are really no different than they are in the Japanese, what I keep calling Saturday morning cartoon versions of these movies. And it should, by that logic, have been just as fun of a romp and should have just been just as exciting. But I don't know what it was exactly, because watching it with, everyone just taking itself so seriously, speaking English from the get-go, it's not being dubbed, you don't have that kind of quirk to it, if you will, if you want to call it that. Without that, it's like, it just comes off as like, wow, everyone is stupid and this makes no sense. There were certain elements of it that I quite enjoyed. I liked that there was some sort of, biological history of all these characters, and that, King Ghidorah he wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't part of the natural order of things. But it was a whole movie where like, we did something stupid, let's undo the stupid thing. And it was just, yeah, I don't know. I really wanted to like it, and I kind of walked out of it being like, I'm not sure if I hated that or not. And I think I'll need to see it again to really know that. It's weird because this movie to me comes off like a movie that was really only meant for people who are either into CGI monster battles or people who are like super fans of Godzilla, which you would think that would apply to me, but I couldn't take it seriously, and I even though I wanted to. And I don't know. I'm still, like I said, I'm still digesting it. It's been weeks and I still don't exactly know how I feel about it, but that's what I think at the moment. And yeah, so it doesn't matter though, because likely this is the last Godzilla movie for a while. I mean, I know they're supposed to do Godzilla versus King Kong, but I believe that one's already in production. But I'm betting, based on the grossing of this film and how poorly it has performed, that they're probably going to slash the budget of that film, of Godzilla vs. King Kong, and it won't be quite the movie we would have hoped. Because it's too bad, because that would have been probably really cool. But I've seen somebody say it best. It's like, this is the third time we've done an American Godzilla movie, and 2 of the 3 bombed, and the one that did well only did well initially and then just kind of fell off. But it basically had the power of nostalgia behind it for a while. So the argument is essentially, it doesn't really matter what you do with Godzilla in the West. He may just not work for us. He may just not be a character that, you know, Americans can get into for the most part. Obviously, there are going to be his fans, the super fans and all that, but there's just not enough of us to support that big of a big blockbuster franchise. And if you've seen Shin Godzilla, then, you know, maybe the Japanese should just hang on to the character and just let him do their thing, because, you know, the Shin Godzilla movie was the best Godzilla movie in a really long time. And it was just a one-off that they decided to do. So, yeah, I mean, there's something like 58 Godzilla movies. I don't remember the exact number. That's not quite that high, but it's more like 25 or 30, something like that. But of all of them, I can't even put any of the American ones in the top 10, much less anywhere near the actual top. So I don't know. Maybe we're just not good at making Godzilla movies. But doesn't matter. Anyway, so that's the end of the podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you very much for listening. As always, thank you very much to the Patreon backers. If, again, anytime you can join up, I would really appreciate it. Obviously, you know, hit like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Follow me on all the social things. Links are in the description. And thank you again to Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Louis Spunia, Michael Kelly, Eric Perez, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. You guys are awesome. And thank the rest of you for just listening. Always appreciated. And I'll see you all later.